Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The last light of the afternoon fell flat across Cedar Flats, a small frontier town built out of stubbornness and dust. The main street was mostly quiet now, just the creak of a sign above the saloon and the slow clip of a horse's hooves on the warped planks of the boardwalk. Elias Ward rode in from a northern pasture with his collar turned up, his coat darkened from melted snow. The air smelled of wet earth and coal smoke from the blacksmith's forge. He'd been gone since dawn, mending fences along the riverbed, and all he wanted was a meal, a warm fire, and silence. But when he turned his horse toward the livery, he stopped. A stagecoach stood beside the post, the horses blowing steam through their nostrils, their harnesses glistening with melted sleet. The driver was unloading luggage, a large trunk, and a carpet bag that didn't belong to anyone in this part of town. Then he saw her. Clara Dawson stepped down from the coach with a careful balance that came from years of control. Her black traveling dress was clean but worn at the edges, her gloves dusty, and her face pale from the long ride west. Her gray hair was tied neatly, though the wind had pulled loose a few strands. She carried herself like a woman used to being obeyed, but not spared from grief. Elias froze where he stood. The space between them felt heavier than the miles she had crossed. He hadn't seen her since the funeral, not in over 8 years, not since the day she buried her daughter, and he buried his wife. For a moment, neither spoke. The driver nodded, muttered something about weather coming in from the ridge, and climbed back up to the coach. Elias dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the muddy street. He wanted to turn back, to pretend he hadn't seen her, but the way she looked at him made that impossible. "Elias," she said, her voice calm but stripped of warmth. He nodded once. "Mrs. Dawson." The formality came out awkwardly, and he regretted it the second it left his mouth. "I wrote you," she said, 3 times. "I got 1 letter," he answered. "Didn't expect you'd come yourself." Her eyes flicked toward the second-floor window of the Mercantile. Behind the glass, a small face appeared, Annie's face. Their daughter, 8 years old, pale hair tied in a short braid, hand pressed against the glass. Clara saw her and straightened her posture as if reminded why she was here. "I came to help raise her," she said. "That's what my daughter would have wanted." Elias looked toward the window, too. Annie was watching them with cautious curiosity, not yet knowing what any of this meant. "Annie's at Mrs. Pike's for the night," he said finally. "I didn't expect company." He picked up the trunk before Clara could protest. It was heavy, but he lifted it with the quiet strength of a man used to long days and no one else to rely on. "We'll talk at the house," he said. Clara followed without a word, her steps quick and precise, her gloved hands gripping the handle of her carpet bag as if the ground beneath her was foreign territory, which it was. The trail out to the ranch was half mud, half frozen ground. The cottonwoods along the creek had shed their leaves, and the wind coming off the ridge carried a sharp, metallic chill. They rode in silence. Elias led his horse while Clara sat stiff in the saddle of another, borrowed from the livery. Every sound, the creak of leather, the crunch of boots on gravel, seemed to underline what neither dared say. Elias had built that ranch with his own hands after the war. He was 26 then, still half a soldier, half a farmer, still believing that land could make a man whole. Then came Hannah, Clara's daughter. She was softer than this country, but she'd followed him west anyway. They made a life for a while, until childbirth took her. Elias never left Cedar Flats after that, never remarried, never forgave himself. Clara had stayed back east. She blamed him for everything that happened on that road the night her daughter died. He knew it from her letters. But now she was here, older, harder, maybe even lonelier than he was. When they reached the ranch, the last of the daylight had faded. The small house stood against the trees, its white paint stripped by wind and time. Smoke curled from the chimney. Elias opened the door, set the trunk down, and stepped aside. Inside, the room was plain but tidy. The wood stove hummed softly. A framed tintype sat on the mantel, Hannah's photograph. Clara's eyes went to it instantly. For a few seconds, she couldn't look away. Then she turned her face toward the window, hiding the tremor that passed through her. "I can sleep in the spare room," she said quietly. Elias nodded. "It's been ready since Annie got her own bed." He filled the basin with warm water, gave her space to settle in. She removed her gloves with slow, deliberate movements. Her fingers were thin and pale from the cold. When she spoke again, her tone was calm, but the weariness beneath it showed. "I came because Annie needs someone steady," she said. "A girl shouldn't grow up alone out here." Elias leaned against the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. "She's not alone." Clara met his gaze. "You work from dawn to dark. Who cooks for her? Who teaches her?" "Elias, she's 8. She needs more than a roof and supper." Her words hit their mark, but he didn't answer right away. He looked toward the window, where the reflection of the lantern light swayed across the glass. "You can stay a while," he said at last. "We'll see how it goes." That night, the three of them ate stew together after Elias fetched Annie from town. The girl talked about Mrs. Pike's cats and the way snow gathered on the schoolhouse fence. Clara smiled politely, trying not to show how strange it felt to hear her granddaughter's voice after years of distance. Elias said little. He watched Annie's small hands moving as she spoke, and Clara's expression softened with every story. Later, after the table was cleared and Annie was asleep, Clara sat near the stove while Elias stood by the door, looking out at the dark fields. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick with the things they hadn't yet faced: grief, blame, guilt. He could feel her eyes on him, measuring, remembering, judging. He didn't know if he wanted forgiveness or if he'd even recognize it if it came. When he finally turned, she was still sitting there, her face calm, but her eyes tired. "It's late," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "It is." He nodded once, blew out the lamp, and went to his room. For the first time in years, the house felt full, but not warm. Not yet. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, carrying the sound of the open land that neither of them could truly escape. And inside, two people, bound by love, loss, and something they couldn't yet name, waited for morning, not knowing that the hardest part of their shared story had only just begun. The morning came gray and cold. Frost glazed the windows, and the fields outside looked washed out, colorless under the first light. The smell of coffee and firewood filled the small house. Elias was already at the table, sleeves rolled up, ledger open, marking down feed deliveries and winter expenses. His handwriting was straight and exact, the product of a man who didn't like surprises. Clara moved quietly around the kitchen, her every action deliberate, the sound of a spoon stirring, the slow scrape of a chair leg. It was their first morning under the same roof in nearly a decade, and both of them felt the weight of it. When Annie patted in barefoot, rubbing her eyes, Clara turned with a small, tentative smile. "Good morning, sweetheart." The girl hesitated. She knew of her grandmother, but memory couldn't reach that far back. Elias looked up, watching. Annie nodded shyly. "Morning," she answered, sitting beside her father. Clara poured her a cup of milk and set down a plate of biscuits she'd baked at dawn. Elias noticed the smell immediately: butter and smoke, the kind he hadn't known in years. For a moment, something in his chest softened, but he didn't let it show. "Got a full day ahead," he said, keeping his tone level. Fence line near the west ridge broke again. "I can help," Clara said. "Annie can stay with me. We'll keep things here." He looked at her, not suspicious, just cautious. "She's used to following me out sometimes." Clara didn't argue, only nodded. "Then we'll find a rhythm. Every house needs one." The exchange was calm, polite, and hollowed out, but it was something. Outside, the ranch was still recovering from the winter storms. Fences leaned, the water troughs were half frozen, and the barns creaked under their own weight. Elias moved through it with silent focus, the way he always did when he didn't want to think. But every sound, the hammer, the creak of a gate, the echo of his own breath, dragged him back to the fact that there was another person inside that house now. He didn't dislike Clara. That wasn't the problem. It was what she reminded him of. Hannah, his wife. Her voice, her laughter, the quiet moments when the wind came through the open window and she'd hum while folding laundry. It had been 8 years, and still her absence filled every corner. And now her mother was in that same kitchen, moving with the same small gestures, speaking with the same sharp tone when she was focused. It was enough to twist his stomach. When Elias came in at midday, his hands rough from the cold, Clara was at the stove cooking stew. She had changed out of her travel clothes and tied her hair back. The kitchen smelled like thyme and beef, something familiar enough to make the house feel alive again. Annie sat on a stool, reading a worn primer that Clara must have found in one of the boxes. "You found her old books," Elias said, taking off his coat. Clara looked over her shoulder. "Your wife's, I assume?" He nodded once, then added quietly, "She used to read that one to Annie before bed. Didn't think anyone would touch it again." Clara hesitated. "Children remember sounds, Elias. Maybe it helps her sleep better." He didn't answer. He just sat down at the table, shoulders bent, watching the steam rise from the stew pot. The silence stretched until Annie broke it. "Papa, are we going to church this Sunday?" Mrs. Pike asked if I'd be in the choir. Elias's head lifted slightly. "If you want to sing, you sing." Clara smiled faintly. "I'll see to her dress. It needs mending." Elias's eyes narrowed slightly at that. Not from anger, but from the oddness of hearing someone take care of something he'd been handling alone for years. The edges of his world were shifting. After dinner, he stepped outside, needing air. The night was calm, the stars sharp above the dark hills. He lit a lantern and walked toward the barn. The cold cut through his shirt and brought back the ache in his shoulders. Inside, the horses shifted and snorted softly. He checked their feed, adjusted the gate, and leaned against a post, staring at the tools hung neatly along the wall. He wondered why Clara had really come. She said it was for Annie, and he believed that. But there was something else. Duty, maybe. Guilt. Or a need to face what was left of her daughter's life. He stayed out there longer than he needed to. Back inside, Clara sat alone by the stove with her sewing kit open on the table. The lamp cast a warm circle of light, and she worked on one of Annie's sleeves. A simple tear, easy to fix. Her movement slowed after a while. Her eyes drifted toward the photograph on the mantel. Hannah's face, smiling, so alive. Clara swallowed hard and looked down again. She hadn't expected the sight of that photograph to hurt as much as it did. She thought she had made peace with it years ago. But standing in her daughter's house, with her daughter's husband and child, made all the things she had buried rise to the surface. The guilt, the letters she never sent, the anger she'd fed to protect herself. When Elias finally came back inside, the sound of the door closing startled her. She turned, needle still in her hand. "I'll fix the roof before the thaw," he said quietly. "Snowmelt's getting in near the chimney." She nodded. "You always did prefer fixing things before they break." He looked at her, tired but steady. "That's how you survive out here." She hesitated, then said what had been sitting heavy in her chest all day. "I didn't come to start over, Elias. I came to make sure Annie has a family left." He didn't reply right away. "She does," he said finally. "But I guess it wouldn't hurt her to have more than one set of hands." The air between them loosened slightly, though it was far from soft. For the first time, something like understanding, fragile and unspoken, took root. Later that night, when the fire burned low, Clara checked on Annie. The girl was asleep, curled up under her blanket, clutching the small cloth doll her mother had made before she was born. Elias stood silently in the doorway. Their eyes met across the room. No words, just quiet acknowledgement. For the first time, Clara didn't look at him as the man who took her daughter west. She saw a father trying to hold his world together. And Elias, watching Clara tuck the blanket around Annie's shoulders, saw not an intruder, but a woman who had lost as deeply as he had, and still came back. When they left the room, Clara whispered, "Good night, Elias." He paused by the hall lamp, nodding once. "Good night." The sound of rain started then, light, uncertain, tapping against the windows as if testing the house's strength. Both of them listened to it for a moment before going their separate ways, each carrying a little less anger than they had that morning, and a little more of something they couldn't yet name. The rain had passed by morning, leaving behind a heavy, cold mist that clung to the grass and wrapped the ranch in silence. The ground was soft and dark, the air thick enough that even the horses moved slower, their breath rising in faint clouds. Elias stepped outside early, his hat low, his boots sinking slightly in the mud as he crossed the yard. He'd barely slept, not because of the weather, but because of the thoughts that kept circling back in the dark. Inside the house, Clara had already been awake. The smell of bread baking came from the stove, and the faint sound of water running in the basin carried through the doorway. She worked with quiet focus, her sleeves rolled up, her hands sure and steady. There was a kind of precision in everything she did, a need for order, maybe to balance the chaos that had once taken everything from her. When Elias came back in, brushing the rain off his coat, Clara glanced at him briefly. "The fences hold. For now," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "We'll need to replace a few posts before spring." She nodded, pulling the bread from the oven. "Then I'll make a list for town. Nails, seeds, soap. Annie needs new shoes, too." Elias froze for a second. It startled him how naturally she'd said it. Annie needs new shoes. No hesitation, no question of permission. He realized how long it had been since someone else had thought of those details. He gave a small nod. "I'll get them when I ride in." "Better to take her along," Clara said. "She should see the town. Meet people. She'll have to grow up here." Elias didn't answer right away. There was a truth in her words that pressed uncomfortably against his old routines. He had built his life around isolation. A man alone was predictable, controllable. Bringing Annie into that world, letting others see her, meant opening the door to questions, to attention, to judgment. "Still," he said quietly, "you're right. I'll take her." Annie came into the room moments later, half asleep, but smiling when she saw the bread cooling on the table. Clara handed her a slice with butter, and the girl took it with both hands. The warmth in that small exchange was something new in the house, something neither adult could fully name. Elias watched them for a moment. The sight stirred a mix of feelings: gratitude, confusion, and the faint ache of seeing a piece of his wife's gentleness alive again through Clara's hands. For the first time, he wondered what Hannah might have thought, if she'd be angry or relieved or something in between. Later that morning, he hitched the wagon, and Annie climbed in with her scarf wrapped tight around her neck. Clara handed up a basket of bread to trade in town, then hesitated. "Don't linger at the saloon," she said. Elias gave her a faint smirk, the closest thing to humor between them yet. "Haven't stepped foot in there in years." "Good," she said, folding her arms. "Then don't start now." For a second, it almost felt like the edge of ordinary conversation, the kind families have when they're not guarding every word. Elias flicked the reins, and the wagon rolled down the muddy road toward town. Cedar Flats looked different in daylight after rain. The mud had swallowed the wheel tracks, and smoke rose cleanly from the blacksmith's forge. Elias stopped near the general store, helping Annie down. She looked around with wide eyes: the sheriff's office, the post, the sound of a piano faintly playing from the saloon down the street. "Stay close," Elias said, and she nodded quickly. Inside the store, they drew a few looks. It wasn't hostility, just the usual curiosity small towns had when change arrived. Mrs. Pike greeted them from behind the counter, cheerful as ever, but her eyes flicked toward Elias with quiet interest. "Didn't expect to see you this early, Elias. Heard your mother-in-law's come out from back east. Just helping with Annie for a while," he said. His tone was measured, leaving no room for gossip. Mrs. Pike smiled politely. "She'll have her hands full, but it's good for the girl. A woman's touch is something a ranch house can't do without." Elias paid for the supplies, nodding once before leading Annie back out. Outside, the sheriff, an old acquaintance from Elias's younger days, tipped his hat. "Ward," he said, "didn't think I'd see the Dawsons in these parts again." Elias paused. The name hung in the air, and Annie looked up, curious. "She came to see her granddaughter," he said quietly. "That's all." The sheriff gave a small nod, reading the tension. "Town's quieter than it used to be," he said. "You're still welcome, long as you stay that way." "I plan to," Elias answered. As they rode home, Annie asked from the back of the wagon, "Papa, why didn't Grandma come before now?" Elias took a moment to answer. "Sometimes people stay away because they don't know how to come back," he said simply. "But she's here now. That's what matters." When they returned, Clara was tending to the fire. The house smelled of stew and clean linen. She looked up when she heard the wagon wheels, relief flickering briefly in her face, not because she had doubted they'd return, but because the house had felt too quiet without them. Annie ran to show her the new shoes. Clara knelt, checking the fit, adjusting the laces. Elias set the supplies down and stood by the door, watching them. "You were right," he said after a moment. She needed new shoes. Clara glanced up, faint surprise softening her expression. "I usually am," she said. There was no pride in her voice, just truth. Elias hesitated. "Mrs. Pike said folks are talking." "They always will," Clara replied. "Doesn't matter. Let them talk. What matters is what happens inside this house, not out there." Her words settled him more than he expected. For the first time in years, someone else seemed willing to share the burden of keeping the world out. That night, as the fire dimmed, Elias found himself at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold. Clara was mending a curtain near the window. Annie was already asleep. The rain had started again, a steady, quiet rhythm on the roof. He broke the silence without looking up. "You're staying longer than you planned?" She paused, threading the needle. "I don't plan to leave soon. Annie needs stability. And whether you'll say it or not, you could use it too." He looked at her then. There was no accusation or tone, no blame, just honesty. For a man who'd spent years speaking to no one but himself and his horses, it was strangely disarming. "She's happy here," Clara added. "And that's the first time I've seen her that way." Elias exhaled, slow and heavy. "Then maybe we keep it that way." Clara gave a faint nod, finishing her stitch. "That's the idea." The wind shifted outside, brushing against the window panes. Inside, the house held steady, warmer, quieter, more alive than it had been in years. And though neither of them would admit it yet, something had begun to take shape between them. Not forgiveness, not affection, but the first small understanding that perhaps they were no longer enemies of circumstance, but survivors learning how to live side by side. The next morning began colder than before, the kind of cold that bit through wool and made the air sharp to breathe. Frost clung to the edges of the window panes, and the grass outside was stiff and pale under the first thin light. Elias rose before dawn, as he always did, but this time the house wasn't silent. He could hear movement from the kitchen, a soft clatter of dishes, the creak of the stove door. Clara was already awake. When he stepped in, she was kneeling near the hearth, stirring the fire with a long iron rod. The glow from the coals painted her face in soft red light, showing the deep lines carved by years of responsibility and loss. For a moment, Elias stood there just watching. There was something unsettling about how easily she had fit herself into this place, into the rhythm he had built alone. "I'll be heading into the south pasture," he said. Without turning, she answered, "Take one of the thermals under your coat." The winds picked up from the ridge. "You'll catch a chill." He hesitated, surprised by the simple familiarity of her tone. "I've managed worse," he muttered, but took the extra layer anyway. When he left, the air was brittle and still. His horse's breath rose in pale clouds, and the sound of the saddle leather creaking filled the silence. The sun hadn't yet reached over the hills, and the whole valley looked drained of color, gray, quiet, distant. He preferred it that way. He spent the morning checking the fence lines and digging out a block stream crossing. But as the hours passed, a storm gathered along the western horizon. The sky turned an unnatural white, the wind twisting and dry. By midday, the first flakes began to fall. Back at the house, Clara noticed the change long before he returned. She had lived through enough winters to know when the weather was turning dangerous. The air inside the cabin had grown heavier, colder. She added more wood to the fire and moved through the rooms with quiet urgency, checking the shutters, sealing the cracks in the doors, setting extra blankets near the stove. Annie followed her around, sensing the tension. "Will Papa be back soon?" the girl asked, her small voice edged with worry. "He will," Clara said firmly, even though she wasn't sure. "Your father knows these lands better than anyone." Annie nodded, trying to believe it. Clara looked at the clock. It was near dusk, and still no sign of him. Elias came back long after the sun had disappeared. The storm had broken fully now, snow swirling in thick sheets that blinded the road. He pushed through it, his coat stiff with ice, the horse trembling under him. When he finally reached the porch, he could barely feel his hands. Clara opened the door before he could knock. The sight of him, soaked, exhausted, his face raw from the wind, sent a quick jolt through her chest. "You should have turned back hours ago," she said sharply, pulling him inside. "How to get the herd under cover," he said, voice rough from the cold. "Sit," she ordered. "You'll freeze standing there." He didn't argue. She took his coat, hung it near the fire, and fetched a blanket. Annie appeared from the hallway, eyes wide. "Papa," she whispered. He gave her a tired smile. "I'm all right." But Clara saw the tremor in his hands as he tried to warm them near the fire. She poured coffee, thick and dark, then set it in front of him. "Drink. It'll help." Elias met her eyes briefly. The first time all day he'd really looked at her. There was no distance in that look, no pretense of politeness. Just the quiet acknowledgement of someone who needed help and got it without asking. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. The storm pinned them inside, the shutters rattling, the fire throwing long, flickering shadows across the room. Hours passed, and still the storm didn't ease. Annie had fallen asleep near the stove, curled up in a blanket. Elias sat at the table, drying his hands, while Clara moved around the room, setting things in order with a kind of nervous precision. Finally, she spoke. "I used to hate the wind when I was a girl. It always sounded like someone was crying." Elias looked up, surprised by the admission. "Still does, some nights." She nodded, folding her hands to still their shaking. "When Hannah wrote me from this place, she said the wind made her feel small. I thought she was exaggerating. Now I understand." He watched her for a long moment, unsure whether to speak. Finally, he said, "She loved it here. She was scared at first, but she learned to live with it." Clara's jaw tightened. "You talk about her like she's still alive." Elias's voice stayed steady. "She's part of everything here. The fence posts, the roof beams, that child asleep by the stove. I can't talk about this place without her name coming up." Clara turned away, her shoulders stiff. "I should have come sooner. Maybe things would have been different." He shook his head. "You couldn't have stopped what happened. No one could." For a long time, there was only the sound of the wind outside and the crackle of the fire. Clara's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "I blamed you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I blamed you for everything. For taking her here. For her dying alone." Elias looked at her, not angry, not defensive, just tired. "I know," he said, "and I blame myself. Every day." Her breath trembled, the fight leaving her. "Then maybe we both carried the same ghost." Elias leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the flames. "Maybe, but it's time we stop letting it run this house." The storm roared louder, shaking the windows until the latch gave a soft snap. Clara moved to close it, but the wind pushed back, spraying a fine mist of snow into the room. Elias stood and crossed the floor to help her. They held the shutters together until the bar caught in place, their hands briefly touching, cold, trembling, but steady. When they turned back toward the room, the firelight threw a golden glow across both of them. Neither spoke for a long time. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound smaller than what they'd already survived. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "You should rest. There's no use waiting up." "I'll stay here by the fire," Elias said, his voice quieter now. "It's warmer that way." She nodded and started toward her room, but paused in the doorway. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked up. "For what?" "For not walking out again." Elias didn't answer, but his expression, calm, resolved, a little raw, told her everything she needed to know. That night, the wind screamed against the roof, but inside the small cabin the fire held steady, burning slow and low. It was the first night in years that the house didn't feel divided by silence. Instead, the space between them had changed, not healed, not yet, but no longer broken. It was something new, fragile, but real, and for the first time since Hannah's death, both Elias and Clara let themselves believe that maybe the worst was finally over. The storm lasted 2 days. When it finally cleared, the land around the ranch looked different, washed quiet, buried in a clean layer of white that reached the top rails of the fence. The air was still. Even the horses stood motionless, steam rising from their nostrils as they waited for warmth to return. Inside, the cabin held the calm aftermath of survival, the kind of stillness that comes when everyone has said what needed to be said and is now left to think about it. Elias woke before dawn, as usual, but he didn't rush outside this time. His body was still heavy from the cold days before, his hands cracked and raw. Clara was already at the table, her hair tied back, reading from an old ledger that had belonged to Hannah. She looked up briefly, her face pale but steady. "The north barn roof sagged under the snow," she said quietly. "You'll need to check it before it gives in." He nodded. "I'll go after breakfast." The way they spoke to each other had changed. Fewer pauses, less hesitation. The storm had stripped something away. Not affection, not forgiveness exactly, but the old fear of what might break if they spoke plainly. Now, everything between them was direct, practical, and unadorned. Annie came in a few minutes later, hair wild, eyes bright from sleep. "Can I come with you today?" she asked. Elias smiled faintly. "Not to the barn. It's cold enough to freeze your boots to the ground." "She can help me inside," Clara said. "We've got enough work here." Annie pouted but obeyed, climbing onto the bench near the fire. Elias took his coat and hat and stepped out into the hard morning light. The snow creaked under his boots as he crossed the yard. The cold stung his skin and made his eyes water, but the world looked clean again, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe he could breathe. He checked the roof beams, shored up the west wall, and fed the horses, moving methodically as always. Routine had saved him more times than luck ever had. When he was done, he stood for a moment, looking back toward the house. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady. Inside that cabin were two people who hadn't been there a few months ago, one by birth, one by choice. And he realized he no longer hated the sight of a second figure moving behind the frosted glass. He went back inside around midday, brushing snow from his shoulders. The warmth hit him immediately. Clara was cooking again, the smell of stew filling the room. Annie was at the table, tracing letters on a scrap of paper with the stub of a pencil. Clara looked up as he entered. "You were out too long," she said. "You'll make yourself sick." Elias shrugged. "Work doesn't stop because the weather's bad. It should, when a man doing it can barely stand." He gave her a dry look, but didn't argue. Instead, he sat down, rubbing his hands together near the stove. "You're sounding more like Hannah every day," he said without thinking. The moment hung heavy in the air. Clara froze. Then she set the ladle down carefully and said, "I'll take that as a compliment." Elias lowered his gaze. It was meant as one. The tension broke, not with laughter, but with something quieter, understanding. For the first time, he realized how much Clara had changed since arriving. The stiffness in her movements was gone. She moved like she belonged here now. That afternoon, the male rider came through, his coat dusted with snow, his horse tired from the long road. He handed Elias a small stack of letters. One was addressed in neat handwriting to Mrs. Clara Dawson, Cedar Flats Ranch. She turned it over, eyes tightening. "It's from my sister," she said. "She didn't even know I left Boston." "You gonna tell her you're staying?" Elias asked. Clara looked out the window, the white landscape reflecting in her eyes. "I haven't decided." He nodded slowly. "No rush. This place doesn't move fast." But the truth was, she had decided. She just hadn't said it yet. The ranch, harsh as it was, had begun to give her something Boston never could: purpose. There, she was a widow surrounded by pity and quiet tea parlors. Here, she was needed. Here, every breath of wind and scrape of wood meant life continuing. As evening fell, Annie grew restless, sitting by the window, watching the dim horizon. "Do you think Grandma will ever leave again?" she asked. Clara looked up from her sewing. "Would you want me to?" Annie shook her head. "No, the house feels bigger when you're here." Elias was by the fire, mending a harness. He stopped, glancing at his daughter, then at Clara. For a man who rarely spoke about feelings, that small exchange hit him harder than he expected. Later, after Annie went to bed, he poured 2 cups of coffee and set one across from Clara. They sat in the quiet kitchen, the fire snapping low. The air between them was calm, no longer heavy with resentment. "You ever think about going back east?" Elias asked, eyes on his cup. Clara thought for a long time. "I used to, but not anymore. There's nothing for me there now. Here, I could still do some good." He nodded slowly. "You already have." Their eyes met, steady and clear. No promises were spoken, no declarations made. But both understood that whatever they were building, however uncertain or unspoken, was real. The next morning brought sunlight, the kind that turned the snow into glass and made every shadow sharp. Elias stepped outside and saw Annie helping Clara hang laundry on the line. The little girl's laughter echoed across the frozen yard, breaking the long silence that had once ruled this place. He watched them for a moment, hands in his pockets, the sun warming his face. Something in his chest eased, something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, not joy exactly, but the quiet knowledge that life was still possible. Clara turned and caught him watching. She didn't say anything, just gave him a small, tired smile. The kind of smile people give when they've stopped running from the past. And for the first time since Hannah's death, Elias smiled back. It wasn't love yet. Not fully, but it was the start of something steady, something worth staying for. Spring came late that year. The snow lingered longer than it should have, melting slowly into the hard earth. The ranch smelled of wet wood and thawing soil, and the sound of dripping water echoed under the eaves. Elias stood on the porch one morning, watching the sun climb over the ridge, its light pale and uncertain. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that color, that faint gold over the hills that meant things might start growing again. Inside, Clara was cleaning the last traces of winter from the house, the heavy blankets, the dried herbs hanging by the window, the soot from the stove. Annie followed her from room to room, talking about the calves she wanted to name and the school lessons Mrs. Pike promised to start again. The air inside was different now, warmer, fuller. There were still quiet moments, but not the kind filled with grief, the kind that comes when people finally learn how to live around their pain instead of under it. When Clara stepped onto the porch with a basket of laundry, Elias looked over. She had shed the black traveling dress she'd worn when she first arrived. Now she wore a plain blue work skirt and a faded shawl. It suited her more. He realized he hadn't seen her that way before, not as a reminder of the past, but as part of the present. "Fence by the creek's down again," he said. She shaded her eyes from the sun. "You'll need help." He smiled faintly. "You volunteering?" "Only if you don't mind me slowing you down." "I wouldn't." It was the first time he'd said those words without hesitation, and she caught it. There was a brief look, quiet, acknowledging, not awkward, and then she went back to her work. By midday, they were both in the pasture. The snow had turned the ground soft and uneven. Elias carried a post driver over his shoulder, and Clara followed with wire coiled around her arm. Annie sat by the fence, humming to herself, holding the bag of nails like she was guarding something precious. They worked in silence for most of the afternoon, the kind of silence that was comfortable, not heavy, not sharp, just the sound of tools, wind, and the occasional rustle of birds in the brush. Every so often, Elias would glance at Clara. Her hands were blistered from the wire, but she didn't complain. She kept working, steady and determined. "You don't need to prove anything," he said finally. She didn't look up. "I'm not proving anything. I'm helping." Elias gave a small nod. "You're doing both." It was meant as a compliment, and it landed that way. Clara smiled just barely, her eyes softening for the first time in weeks. When the last post was set and the fence line stretched straight again across the thawing field, Elias stood back, looking it over. "That'll hold," he said. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt. "Until the next storm. Then we'll fix it again." Something about that simple exchange stayed with both of them. The unspoken idea that not everything had to break permanently. Some things could be mended again and again until they held. That evening, after Annie had gone to bed, the two of them sat by the stove. The glow of the fire painted the walls gold. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and set one near her. He had been thinking all day about something he hadn't asked, something that had hung between them since her arrival. "Why did you really come here, Clara?" he asked. His voice wasn't sharp, just quiet. I know you said it was for Annie, but there's more to it. She sat still, staring at the fire. At first, it was duty, she said finally. I thought I owed it to my daughter. I blamed you for her death. I thought if I came here and saw the life she lived, I'd have proof, one way or another, of who was to blame. Elias didn't move. He let her speak. But when I got here, she continued, I saw that it wasn't that simple. Hannah chose this life. You didn't drag her west. She loved you, and she believed in this land. Maybe too much. I couldn't see that from Boston. I only saw what I lost. Elias's hands tightened around the cup. You were right to blame me, he said quietly. I should have gotten her to town sooner. I thought I could handle it on my own. I was wrong. Clara looked at him, then really looked at him. You did what you could, and you've been punishing yourself ever since. That's not love anymore, Elias. That's a cage. He looked down, his jaw set, and then gave a faint, resigned nod. Maybe so. For a long time, the only sound was the fire. Then Clara reached out, her hand resting lightly over his on the table. The gesture was small, but it carried more than words could. He didn't pull away. The days that followed carried a calm kind of routine. Elias repaired the barn roof. Clara worked in the garden behind the house. Annie began her lessons again. The town started to talk less. The whispers about the widow and the rancher fading as quickly as they'd started. Mrs. Pike stopped by one afternoon with a loaf of bread and a knowing smile. Looks like you've got things running smooth again, Elias. He gave a small, measured smile. Getting there. Well, she said, glancing toward Clara in the doorway. Looks to me like the house finally has a woman's hand again. Don't let her slip away. Elias said nothing, but the comment lingered. That night, after the lamps were out and the house was quiet, he stood on the porch alone. The stars stretched endless above the dark line of the hills. The air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke. He could hear Clara moving faintly inside, the sound of her footsteps soft against the floorboards. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something to end. He felt like he was standing at the start of something new. When Clara joined him on the porch a few minutes later, she didn't ask what he was thinking. She just stood beside him, folding her arms against the chill. Tomorrow, I'll ride into town, she said. Send a letter to my sister. Tell her I'm staying. Elias turned to her. For good. For good, she said. If you'll have me here. He didn't hesitate. You already are. They stood there while longer, side by side, the quiet stretching out easy between them. Inside, the fire burned low, and through the window, the house glowed warm against the endless night. For the first time in a long time, Elias Ward believed that maybe this land, this hard, unforgiving land, had given him one last chance to build something worth keeping. The following weeks passed with a steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar to Elias. The land, though still harsh, had begun to soften with spring. The pastures grew in patches of faint green. The creek ran full again, and the ranch carried the quiet rhythm of a place finally learning to breathe. Inside the house, that same change had taken root. Not sudden or loud, but slow and sure, like the thawing of long frozen ground. Clara had settled fully now. Her few belongings from Boston, a small mirror, 2 books, and a folded shawl of fine wool, had found places among the rough Western furniture. She had begun keeping accounts for the ranch, handwriting clean and exact, balancing expenses with the same precision she used to fold the sheets. Elias respected that. He had never been good with numbers, only with work. Together, they made sense. Annie thrived under the new routine. She learned to read faster, to brush the horses properly, to measure ingredients when helping Clara cook. Her laughter echoed through the cabin in ways it hadn't since Hannah's days. And when she fell asleep at night, Clara would sit by her bed until her breathing turned steady, while Elias stood at the door, watching silently, always careful not to intrude in the quiet tenderness that filled that room. Life had become bearable again, and that was something neither of them had thought possible. But peace, Elias knew, was fragile. Out here, one bad storm, one wrong decision, could undo everything. One afternoon, while Elias was tightening a fence post by the lower pasture, he saw a rider approaching from the south. The man was unfamiliar, tall, young, dust-covered, wearing a sheriff's star pinned crookedly to his vest. He reined in his horse and nodded. Elias Ward? Elias straightened. That's right. Got a letter here from the county office in Santa Fe. Property review. They're updating ownership records. Elias frowned. I filed the claim years ago. The man handed him the envelope. Looks like they're checking boundaries again. Some new law about titles and guardianship. You'll want to read it. He tipped his hat and rode off. Elias stood there for a moment, the paper heavy in his hand. Guardianship. That word struck a nerve. He broke the seal and read. The letter was formal, a request for confirmation of Annie's legal guardianship, with a note that her maternal grandmother's presence would require co-signing for future property inheritance. It wasn't a threat, but it was enough to stir old worries. That evening, he laid the letter on the table while Clara and Annie were finishing supper. Clara glanced at it, recognizing the official seal. What's that? She asked. County wants an update on Annie's guardianship, he said. They're checking names on the deed. Clara's expression tightened. And they want mine. They need both of ours, Elias replied. It was a long pause. The air in the room shifted, that old tension creeping back in. Clara looked down, tracing the edge of her spoon against the bowl. If you want me to stay here as her guardian, Elias, you'll have to accept that it won't just be your name that matters. Elias met her gaze evenly. It already isn't just my name that matters. She studied him for a moment, the quiet certainty in his tone, the absence of pride or resistance, and then nodded slowly. Then we'll sign it together. They rode into Cedar Flats the next morning. The sun was bright, the streets muddy from last night's rain. The townsfolk watched them pass. Elias, steady and silent as ever, and Clara, sitting tall beside him in the wagon, her hands folded neatly in her lap. They stopped at the small county office near the general store. Inside, the clerk, a narrow-faced man with spectacles perched low on his nose, greeted them politely. Mr. Ward, Mrs. Dawson, this is about the child's guardianship, correct? Clara glanced at Elias, then said clearly, Yes. I live with my granddaughter and her father. We'll be signing together. The clerk dipped his pen in ink. Understood. It took less than 10 minutes. A few signatures, a few affirmations, but something in those written lines carried more weight than either expected. When the clerk stamped the final page and said, That makes it official, Clara exhaled softly. Outside, the air smelled of sun-warmed wood and dust. Annie, waiting in the wagon, waved when she saw them. Elias helped Clara up beside him, and as the wagon started rolling again, he said, That paper changes things for you. She shook her head. It doesn't change what's already true. I just signed what we've been living for months. Elias gave a small, approving nod. Fair enough. That evening, after Annie went to bed, they sat together on the porch, the stars scattered wide over the dark hills. The air was cool but gentle. Elias leaned back against the rail, his voice low. You could have gone back after the snow melted. Boston, your sister, all of it. Why didn't you? Clara took a moment before answering. Because that life was finished. I used to think the past was where my purpose was buried, with my husband, with Hannah, but it wasn't. It was here, waiting. I just didn't have the courage to face it. He studied her face in the faint light. You're not afraid anymore? Still am, she said honestly. But fear doesn't mean I have to run. Her words hit him deeper than she knew. 4 years, running, from guilt, from loss, from any kind of hope, had been all he knew how to do. But somehow, without ever meaning to, Clara had stopped that motion. He looked out over the fields, the fences they'd built together, stretching clean and even across the land. This place feels different now, he said quietly. It used to feel like punishment. Now it feels like home again. Clara followed his gaze. Then let's keep it that way. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the wind through the cottonwoods and the distant creak of the barn door. Elias felt a calm he hadn't known since his youth. Not excitement, not relief, just peace. He turned toward her. You ever think Hannah would have wanted this? For us to still be here? Clara nodded slowly. I think she wanted her daughter growing up loved and safe. And I think she'd be glad we found a way to do that together. Elias took that in, the weight of it settling gently over him. Then we'll make sure we never lose it. The night deepened, the stars thickening overhead. Inside, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. For the first time since they'd met, there was no distance left between them. No blame, no ghosts. Only the sound of the land breathing around them, and the quiet, unspoken certainty that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. And as Clara rose to go inside, Elias stayed on the porch a while longer, listening to the faint laughter of his daughter in her sleep and realizing that the silence around him no longer felt empty. It felt earned. By the time summer settled over Cedar Flats, the land had turned golden. The grass waved high across the pastures, the creek ran low and clear, and the air smelled of sage and sun-warmed dust. The ranch had changed in small, quiet ways, just as its people had. The sounds were different now. Laughter, clinking dishes, a woman's voice calling from the porch, a little girl's footsteps running through the yard. It no longer felt like a lonely stretch of earth. It felt lived in, claimed, and cared for. Elias woke early each morning, but now he didn't rise to silence. Clara was always up before him, moving through the kitchen with the soft rhythm of someone who had found her place. She hummed sometimes, a habit he hadn't heard since Hannah's time, and that small sound carried through the rooms like sunlight through thin curtains. Annie followed her everywhere, learning things her father never could teach her: sewing, cooking, patience. Elias noticed how naturally it had all come together, how smoothly they had fallen into being a family again, though none of them had said the word aloud. It didn't need saying anymore. Still, there were questions that lingered, ones that had followed since the beginning. What would happen if Clara decided she couldn't stay through another harsh winter? What if the ghosts they had finally quieted found their way back in? But those questions faded more with each passing week, replaced by something steady and real. One Sunday morning, they rode into town for church. The last time they'd done that, people had whispered when Clara walked beside him. This time, the whispers were gone. Mrs. Pike greeted them warmly. The sheriff tipped his hat. Even the pastor, an older man who had known Elias since his early years, gave him a nod that carried something close to respect. After the service, while Annie played near the water trough, Clara spoke quietly to the pastor. Elias stood nearby, listening just enough to catch her tone, steady, sure without apology. "I'd like to hold a small gathering at the ranch," she said, "to make things right in the eyes of the town, and for Annie." The pastor smiled faintly. "A blessing, you mean?" "Something like that," Clara replied. "Not a spectacle, just a proper start." Elias met her eyes across the yard and gave a slow nod. A week later, the house was fuller than it had ever been. Neighbors came with food and folded chairs. The Pikes brought flowers, and the sound of horses tied along the fence carried over the field. The afternoon was bright, the sky high and open. Annie wore a pale blue dress Clara had sewn herself, and she ran between the guests with a kind of joy that made Elias's chest ache in a good way. When the pastor began speaking, the crowd quieted. His words were simple, about family, about resilience, about what it meant to build something worth keeping after everything else had fallen apart. He looked at Elias and Clara as he spoke. "Sometimes the hardest roads are the ones that lead us home again," he said, his voice carrying across the still air. Elias stood tall beside Clara, his hand resting lightly on her back. When the pastor finished, he turned to her, the noise of the crowd fading behind them. "We've been through worse," he said quietly. Clara smiled. "Then this should be easy. There are no vows this time, no rehearsed words. Just a mutual understanding, spoken with their eyes. After everything they'd endured, grief, guilt, loneliness, they had already built what mattered most: trust." When Annie ran up and grabbed both their hands, Clara squeezed Elias's tightly. "Is it over?" Annie asked. "It's just beginning," Clara said, her tone soft but certain. That evening, after the guests had gone, the three of them sat on the porch, watching the sun fall behind the hills. The air was still warm, the light deep and golden. Annie dozed against Clara's shoulder, her small hand clutching the edge of her mother's old shawl. Elias leaned back in his chair, his hat tipped low, and let out a quiet breath. "You ever think about what she'd say?" he asked after a long silence. Clara didn't need him to explain who he meant. "Hannah." He nodded. I think she'd tell us to stop looking backward, Clara said, and to keep this place alive for her daughter, for her father, for what's left of us all. Elias nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. The wind stirred across the field, carrying the smell of sage and hay. The ranch stretched wide and quiet beneath the darkening sky. For years, this house had been a monument to loss. Now it was something else, something alive. Clara looked toward him, her voice low and steady. You know, Elias, when I came here, I thought I was saving a child. I didn't realize I'd end up saving us both. He turned to meet her eyes. You did more than that. You brought this place back to life. They sat together until the last light faded, the sky turning deep blue above the hills. Annie stirred in her sleep, murmuring something soft, then settled again. Elias reached over and covered her hand with his. We'll keep her safe, he said quietly, no matter what comes. Clara nodded, her face calm in the dim light. We already have. The world outside was silent except for the faint hum of crickets and the faraway howl of a coyote. The ranch stood strong against the horizon, its windows glowing faintly through the dark. Inside, the warmth of the fire spread across the walls, and for the first time in years, Elias Ward's house felt whole. There were no ghosts left, no unfinished questions, no distance between them anymore. Just a family, bound not by what they'd lost, but by what they'd chosen to keep. And as the night deepened and the stars filled the sky, the sound of Clara's quiet laughter joined the wind, carrying through the valley like the last line of a story finally finished.